August 7, 1942, 11:23 a.m., 14,000 feet above Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thach watched 9 Japanese Zeros tear through his formation of Grumman F4F Wildcats like wolves through sheep. In less than 30 seconds, 3 American fighters were burning, spiraling toward the jungle below. The Japanese pilots weren't just winning. They were toying with the Americans, their nimble Zeros dancing around the heavier Wildcats with casual contempt. Thach's wingman, Ensign Robert Dibb, screamed over the radio as a Zero locked onto his tail. "I can't shake him. He's right on me. I can't." The radio went silent. Dibb's Wildcat exploded in a ball of orange flame. Every American pilot in the Pacific knew the brutal mathematics of air combat against the Zero. You couldn't turn with them. You couldn't climb with them. You couldn't run from them. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero could outmaneuver anything the Americans could put in the air. It was 1,500 pounds lighter than the Wildcat, climbed faster, turned tighter, and had a range that seemed impossible. Japanese pilots, veterans of China and Pearl Harbor, flew these magnificent machines with skill that bordered on artistry. In 6 months of war, the Zero had established complete air superiority across the Pacific. American pilots were dying at a rate of 3 to 1. Some squadrons lost 80% of their pilots in their first month of combat. The Japanese weren't just winning. They were slaughtering American aviators with mechanical efficiency. But on that August morning above Guadalcanal, Jimmy Thach was about to demonstrate something that would reverse the balance of power in the Pacific sky. A simple tactical maneuver, so basic it could be taught in an afternoon, that would transform the invincible Zero from predator into prey. Within a year, the aircraft that had terrorized the Pacific would become a death trap for its pilots, and Japanese aces who had laughed at the clumsy American fighters would learn to fear a weave pattern that meant certain death. This is the story of how American pilots learned to turn the Zero's greatest strength into its fatal weakness, how inferior aircraft defeated superior ones through pure tactical brilliance, and how the Japanese Navy's invincible fighter became a flying coffin once American pilots stopped trying to fight like the Japanese and started fighting like Americans. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The Zero arrived in American consciousness like a nightmare. As Japanese fighters strafed Hickam Field and Ford Island, American pilots got their first glimpse of an aircraft that would redefine their understanding of air combat. The Zeros moved with a grace that seemed impossible for a combat aircraft. They turned inside the lumbering American fighters attempting to get airborne, shooting them down with contemptuous ease. Lieutenant George Welch, one of the few American pilots to get airborne during the attack, managed to shoot down 4 Japanese aircraft. But his after-action report was sobering. "Their fighters are incredible. They turn on a dime. Our P-40s are like trucks compared to them. If there had been more of them, none of us would have made it back." In the months following Pearl Harbor, American intelligence scrambled to understand what they were facing. The reports from pilots who survived encounters with Zeros painted a picture of an aircraft that shouldn't exist, a fighter that could outmaneuver anything in the sky, while maintaining enough range to escort bombers 1,000 miles from their carriers. It violated every principle of aircraft design. You couldn't have extreme maneuverability and long range and speed. You had to choose. Somehow, the Japanese had created a fighter that did it all. The secret, American engineers would eventually discover, was that the Japanese had chosen to sacrifice everything for performance. The Zero had no armor protecting the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no redundant systems. It was built as light as possible, with structural strength barely adequate for combat maneuvering. This made it spectacularly maneuverable. It also made it spectacularly vulnerable. But in early 1942, American pilots didn't know about these vulnerabilities. All they knew was that trying to dogfight a Zero was suicide. Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare, flying from the carrier Lexington, survived an encounter with Zeros in February 1942 that left him shaken despite shooting down 5 Japanese bombers. The Zeros that came after me were like nothing I'd ever faced. One got on my tail, and I tried every evasive maneuver I knew. Nothing worked. He stayed with me through every turn. If he'd had more ammunition, I'd be dead. They're better than us in the air. That's just a fact. The statistics confirmed what pilots already knew. In the first 6 months of the Pacific War, Japanese pilots were shooting down American aircraft at a ratio of 3-to-1. Some engagements were even more lopsided. At the Battle of Java Sea, Zeros decimated Dutch and American fighters without losing a single aircraft. At Port Darwin, Australia, Zeros shot down 11 Allied fighters and didn't suffer a single loss. American pilots were brave, they were well trained, but courage and training weren't enough when your opponent had a better aircraft and more experience. The crisis came to a head in March 1942, when Commander John Thach, one of the Navy's most experienced fighter tacticians, was tasked with developing new tactics for the F4F Wildcat. Thach had been studying combat reports from Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Philippines. The pattern was clear and terrifying. Every American fighter pilot who tried to dogfight a Zero died. Every single one. "We can't beat them flying the way we've been trained," Thach told his squadron commanders at North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego. "Everything we know about air combat, everything the textbooks teach, gets you killed against the Zero. We need something new." Thach understood the fundamental problem. The Zero's advantage was its ability to turn. In a turning fight, the aircraft that could complete the turn first could get its guns on the enemy. The Zero could always turn faster, so American pilots needed to stop turning. But how do you fight without turning? How do you get your guns on an enemy who can outmaneuver you? The answer came to Thach while watching his young daughter play with a toy. She was weaving string back and forth in a pattern. Thach stared at the weaving motion, and suddenly he saw it. A way to use 2 aircraft working together to create a defensive pattern that would trap any enemy trying to follow one of them. He called it the Thach Weave. The concept was brilliantly simple. 2 Wildcats would fly parallel to each other, separated by about 200 feet. When a Zero attacked one Wildcat, that pilot would turn toward his wingman. The wingman would simultaneously turn toward his leader. As they crossed, the Zero following the first Wildcat would find itself flying directly into the guns of the second Wildcat. If the Zero tried to follow through the turn, it would be shot down. If it broke off the attack, the American pilot would escape. Either way, the Zero's advantage in turning performance became irrelevant. Thach tested the weave with his pilots in training exercises. The results were immediate and dramatic. Pilots playing the role of Zeros found themselves trapped every time. No matter how much better their turning performance, the geometry of the weave meant they couldn't attack one aircraft without exposing themselves to the other. "It's not fancy," Thach told his pilots. "It requires iron discipline. When your wingman calls for the weave, you turn toward him no matter what, even if a Zero is on your tail. Even if every instinct is screaming to turn away, you turn toward your wingman. Trust the geometry." The first combat test of the Thach Weave came on June 4th, 1942, during the Battle of Midway. Thach led 6 Wildcats from the carrier Yorktown against a Japanese strike force escorted by Zeros. The Americans were outnumbered more than 2 to 1. Every pilot knew they were probably going to die. Then the Zeros attacked. Thach's after-action report captured what happened next with clinical precision. At 10:35 hours, 6 Zero fighters dove on our formation from 2,000 feet above. I called for Weave Pattern Alpha. My wingman, Ensign Brassel, and I executed the maneuver as briefed. The lead Zero followed me into my turn. As I crossed Brassel's flight path, Brassel fired a 2-second burst. The Zero exploded. The remaining Zeros broke off attack. In less than 10 seconds, the Thach Weave had done what months of conventional tactics couldn't. It had killed a Zero in a direct engagement and forced the others to retreat. The Weave wasn't perfect. It required precise timing, mutual trust, and constant communication. But it worked. American pilots finally had a way to survive against the Zero. More than survive, a way to win. Lieutenant Marion Carl, flying Wildcats from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, became one of the first Marines to master the Thach Weave. In August 1942, his division of 4 Wildcats encountered 15 Zeros at 12,000 feet. Using the Weave, they shot down 4 Zeros without loss. Carl's combat report emphasized the psychological impact. The Japanese pilots seemed confused. They're used to getting behind us and staying there. When we executed the Weave, they didn't know how to react. One pilot actually flew straight into my line of fire, apparently not understanding what we were doing. Japanese pilots, accustomed to easy victories, were suddenly dying, and they didn't understand why. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest aces with over 60 victories, encountered the Thach Weave over Guadalcanal in August 1942. His account, written after the war, captured Japanese bewilderment. "We attacked 2 American fighters, fat Grumman planes that should have been easy kills. I positioned behind the leader for a certain kill. Then they did something strange. They turned toward each other. As I followed my target, his wingman appeared in front of me, firing. I barely escaped. We tried again with the same result. These Americans had learned a new trick, and it was deadly. By September 1942, every American fighter squadron in the Pacific was training in the Thach Weave. The tactic was simple enough that green pilots could execute it after just a few practice flights. More experienced pilots developed variations, creating complex weaving patterns with 4 or 6 aircraft that turned the sky into a deadly trap for Japanese fighters. The Zero pilots, masters of individual aerial combat, found themselves helpless against coordinated American tactics. The Weave worked because it removed individual skill from the equation. It didn't matter if the Japanese pilot was more experienced. The geometry of the Weave meant he would be shot down if he pressed his attack. The psychological reversal was complete. Japanese pilots who had hunted American fighters with casual confidence now approached combat with trepidation. Those weaving Wildcats meant death. But the Thach Weave was just the beginning of American tactical innovation. pilots discovered other ways to exploit the Zero's weaknesses once they understood the fundamentals. The Zero's light construction, which gave it spectacular maneuverability, made it vulnerable to damage. American pilots learned that just a few hits from the Wildcat's 6.50 caliber machine guns would set a Zero on fire. The lack of self-sealing fuel tanks meant even minor damage often proved fatal. Major John L. Smith, commanding Marine Fighting Squadron 223 on Guadalcanal, developed the boom and zoom tactic specifically for the Zero. Don't try to turn with them. Use your diving speed. The Wildcat is heavier and faster in a dive. Attack from above, fire a quick burst, extend away in a dive. If you hit them, they burn. If you miss, they can't catch you in the dive. The Americans also learned to exploit the Zero's poor high-speed handling. Above 300 miles per hour, the Zero's controls became heavy and unresponsive. American pilots could outmaneuver Zeros at high speed, even though the Japanese fighter was superior in slow-speed turning. Captain Joe Foss, who would become one of America's top aces with 26 victories, described the evolution in American thinking. In January 1943, we weren't afraid of Zeros anymore. We knew their tricks. We knew their weaknesses. Most importantly, we knew how to fight them. The Weave kept us alive while we learned everything else. Without the Weave, none of us would have survived long enough to become experienced. By early 1943, the kill ratio in the Pacific had reversed. American pilots were shooting down Japanese aircraft at rates that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. The Zero, once invincible, was becoming a liability. Japanese pilots died in increasing numbers as American squadrons filled with veterans who understood how to turn the Zero's agility into a trap. The Japanese tried to adapt. They developed new tactics, new formations, new training methods. But the fundamental problem remained. The Zero's design philosophy, sacrifice protection for performance, worked perfectly when facing inferior opponents. Against opponents who understood its weaknesses, that same philosophy became fatal. Lieutenant Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, one of Japan's greatest aces, wrote in his diary in March 1943, "The Americans have learned to fight. They no longer try to turn with us. They attack in pairs, using coordination we cannot match. When we pursue one, his wingman shoots us down. When we try to attack their bombers, their fighters execute these weaving patterns that create a wall of fire. We are losing our best pilots, and we cannot replace them." The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated how completely the balance had shifted. Japanese naval aviation, once the finest in the world, sent 373 aircraft against the American fleet. American fighters using the Thach Weave and improved aircraft shot down 243 Japanese planes while losing just 29 of their own. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Zero hadn't changed. It was still maneuverable, still had excellent range, still capable of spectacular aerobatic performance. But the Americans had learned that maneuverability without protection was a death sentence, that fighting smart beat flying fancy, that two average pilots working together could defeat the best individual pilot in the world. The final statistics told the story of American innovation versus Japanese tradition. By 1945, American pilots were achieving kill ratios of 10-to-1 or better against Japanese fighters. The Zero, which had terrorized the Pacific in 1942, was being massacred by 1945. At the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, a restored F4F Wildcat sits near a captured Zero. A placard describes the Thach Weave with diagrams showing the crossing pattern. Below is a quote from a Japanese pilot captured in 1945. "We thought the Americans were cowardly because they wouldn't dogfight." We didn't understand they were being smart. By the time we realized their weaving tactic was brilliant, it was too late. Half our experienced pilots were dead, shot down by pairs of Americans working together. The Zero was still the best dogfighter in the sky. But dogfighting had become obsolete. Jimmy Thach would retire from the Navy as an admiral. His simple weave pattern, sketched on a napkin during a training session, saved thousands of American lives. It turned the tide in the Pacific not through superior technology, but through superior thinking. The Japanese had built a beautiful aircraft. The Americans built a beautiful tactic. And in war, tactics beat technology every time. The lesson echoed through aviation history. Individual brilliance couldn't defeat systematic coordination. The best aircraft meant nothing without the best tactics. And sometimes the winning move wasn't to fight the enemy's fight better. It was to change the rules of the fight entirely. By 1945, Zero pilots knew that weaving pattern meant death. They learned to break off when they saw it forming, but breaking off meant failing their mission. Pressing the attack meant dying. The Americans had created a tactical trap with no escape. The mighty Zero, which had dominated the Pacific sky, had become a relic. Not because American aircraft got better, the Wildcat was obsolete by 1945, but because American pilots got smarter. They stopped trying to outturn the Zero and started outsmarting the Zero. In the end, Japanese pilots had laughed at the slow, heavy American fighters. But Americans had the last laugh, and it sounded like the roar of .50 caliber machine guns firing from the perfect position, off the wing of their buddy in the Weave.